All right, welcome everyone to the webinar hosted by Frontline Data Solutions. My name is Ren Lu You, and I'm the CEO of Frontline. Our guest today is consultant and board certified safety professional Daniel Hughes. Daniel has almost 40 years of experience in the EHS field and has worked all over the world, from Antarctica to Libya in different industries. And today we're here to talk to him about chemical safety. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you very much, sir. Appreciate you having me on.
So Dan, I'd love to hear a bit more about your professional background and the context in which you've learned about issues related to chemical safety. So
Certainly.
Give me a little bit of just a quick rundown of some of your experience.
Yes, sir. Thanks for the floor. In the early 1980s, well, actually, it was in 1980. I joined a refining company. It had a refinery and chemical plant. And we did 160,000 barrels of oil a day, plus all the byproducts, and a chemical plant that was right next door that was also our property. I started out there as a laborer. I moved into operations safety. So I did some plant operations, worked in the maintenance department for a while. And then I had a friend who was killed in an incident that brought a lot of attention around the country, and especially in California, to the problems with that particular facility. It also brought my awareness of safety to a different level than it had ever been before, because he was a friend of mine, someone I had carpooled with and fished with, and I knew his family. So it was a very direct impact for me. I had the opportunity to join the safety department. We got a new safety manager in. He said, I see that you're observant. I like some of the skills you possess, but you have a lot to learn. And I knew that I did. And I said, yeah, but I'm up for the challenge. So I joined the safety department in 1984. And from that point forward, it just catapulted my career. I learned a lot about chemical safety because that was the business we were in. And that was also one of the low points for us. Also, I recognized that although OSHA had been around for a while, we weren't doing many of the things that we should have been doing. That got my attention and my focus immediately, and I started trying to implement some things as I was learning. And so when you're learning these things and you're trying to implement changes, there's a little bit of resistance, but that resistance I found was good because it challenged me. And the challenge that it brought to me was I really need to know my stuff, because I can't go ask people that have been doing this for 30 or 40 years to change unless I give them an alternative. And so I started presenting the alternatives. Sometimes they weren't received well, and other times they were. But regardless, it ended up being, I think, a better facility when we were all done. So I signed on with the Parsons Corporation in 2001. That was a great opportunity for me. I learned, I moved into construction first because that's what I knew. Then after a period of time, they asked me to move over to chemical weapons destruction, which I did in Indiana from 2001. After the end of that, we destroyed the nation's stockpile of VX. Once that was completed, they asked me to move here and then to do this over there. And pretty soon I just found myself embedded with this company where I stayed for 21 years. In February, like I said, I retired from Parsons. And then shortly afterwards, I started Peak Safety Solutions, Inc., which is a one-man operation here to just continue in my career on a semi-retired type basis, because I don't want to take a full-time job anymore. Ren, what I want to do is just go to jobs that are interesting, where I think I can make an impact, and then help others bring their safety performance to a peak level.
Gotcha. Okay, well, great. Well, I mean, it sounds like you have a wealth of experience, and certainly I don't get to talk to folks who've worked with and destroying chemical weapons very often, even in this line of work where people are working with hazardous chemicals pretty often, and that's an extraordinary level of hazard if we're talking about dealing with things that were intended for to kill people, essentially. So
yes, sir.
Yeah. Well, so let's dive right in here. So what I wanted to ask you about exposure hazards in chemical safety. So can you tell us a bit about exposure hazards, and what should safety professionals know when working with chemicals vis-a-vis exposure hazards?
Yeah, so there are really, as you probably already know, 4 routes of exposure. The 3 primary routes, and the most hazardous is number 1 is the respiratory. That's the one that will have the greatest effect on us. It's the one that is the quickest way into the bloodstream. It's the one that will have the most dramatic effect, whether it be immediate or chronic, prolonged. But either way, that's going to have the most dramatic effect on us. So, there's many that we can talk about, but those are certainly, that's certainly number one. The other one is ingestion. So, and a lot of times, these products, these materials, these chemicals can be ingested, but we don't think about how they're being ingested. We just think about, well, ingestion, nobody's going to pick up a bottle of sulfuric acid and drink it down intentionally. Nobody does that. Or VX, a nerve agent, or, any other thing out there. Nobody's going to pick it up and just do that, but we do it inadvertently. There are other ways that we can ingest these chemicals. For instance, paraquat's coming on the scene now, and you'll see a lot of information about paraquat that's used to spray down, and it's as an insecticide or rodenticide, and it's used on crops. Well, there's a lot of push now. You'll see that they're associating paraquat with Parkinson's disease. And so low level exposure over a prolonged period of time to paraquat is now being tagged directly to Parkinson's disease. Well, that's a chronic exposure, or that's a chronic effect, if you will. And but we could ingest it not even knowing, right? We could eat fruits and vegetables, and there you go. If they're not properly cleaned and washed, there you go. Now you've had a paraquat exposure. That's just one example. Absorption through the skin is probably the other one that, although we try and protect against it, it's the one that can also have a dramatic effect on us. And what we oftentimes overlook is the largest organ in the body is not the lungs, it's not the liver, it's not the bloodstream, it's actually our skin, our outer protective level. That's the largest living organ in our body. So biggest surface area, and a good probability there that we could have an exposure. The other one that doesn't get talked a lot about until bloodborne pathogens came around is the injection. And believe it or not, injections can happen in industry as well. And I look back and I remember back to opening up, or not opening up, but trying to put lids onto 55-gallon drums. And with the band or the ring that holds that lid in place, and you get your hand caught in there, you get your hand pinched in there, and whatever's on that lid is now inside your skin. So injection injuries can come with cuts from glass. They can come with cuts of metal or shards of metal. And whatever's on that metal or whatever's on that glass is now in your bloodstream because you've injected it into your system. So those are 4 routes. I hope I answered your question.
No, you did. That's perfect. Okay, so you work with a lot of clients. So I'm curious to hear what sort of, if a client is dealing with a lot of chemical safety incidents, what would you, and you were brought onto the scene to kind of investigate and help them resolve this issue. What would be some of the first things you look at when trying to diagnose the problem?
Yeah, and I think for a lot of folks, you might think that the first thing you look at is, well, let's see the history of these injuries and let's see what each one of them was. And that may be a good place to start. I'm not sure that's where I would start. I think I would start with, let's talk about your hazard assessment and risk analysis. Let's start with your library of safety data sheets. What chemicals, what are used the most often? And let's look at the hazard assessment and the risk analysis that you performed, and was it adequate? That, I think, is the place where I would look first, because once you've identified the hazards, and once you've assessed what those hazards are and determined what the risks are associated with each one of those hazards, then you can look at your hierarchy of controls, which I think is often overlooked. And what hierarchy of control did you decide to implement? Did you jump immediately to personal protective equipment? And if you did, that was probably a mistake, because there are other parts of the hierarchy of control that maybe we should have looked at, like, for instance, elimination or substitution. Why are we using this chemical when there's one that might do the same function for you with less hazards associated and lower the risk profile? If we can lower the risk profile by using the hierarchy of controls without jumping directly to PPE, we really eliminate a lot of that risk. And I think in many cases that may be the issue. That is certainly, in my experience, that has been the issue.
That's great. I mean, that's great insight. Basically, I guess I would describe it as tackling the problem, an upstream problem, rather than trying
Yeah.
to tackle a downstream problem.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. You eliminate the risk to the employee by tackling it upstream rather than downstream. That's a good way of
Yeah.
putting it. Yeah.
Great. So, what are some common mistakes that organizations make when they're trying to conduct risk analyses and hazard assessments? So, well, what are some of the common pitfalls that you see when
Yeah.
they're doing
So
this?
some of the common mistakes are again, we talk about how they initiate the hierarchy of controls, but past that, we've already discussed that. Let's talk about inadequate chemical specific training. Sometimes there are some companies and some employers and some will overlook the fact that you need to do chemical specific training, not just hazard communications training. And this is where the SDS book is kept, or this is where the information is. How about taking a look, especially at your high risk or high hazard chemical inventory, and let's look at the ones that are really going to cause the most harm, the ones that are the most dangerous to work with, the ones that create the highest risk for your employees, and specifically focus on them for training sessions. For instance, in the refining business, in oil refining, hydrogen sulfide is one that still to this day there are fatalities every year due to hydrogen sulfide exposure. And yet refineries and chemical companies that produce or have an off gas of hydrogen sulfide do train specifically for hydrogen sulfide. So if we're still training specifically for some of those chemicals, but we're still having fatalities, are we doing an adequate job? Have we really given our employees the tools to combat things that we know could cause them serious injury or death? And I think it's safe to say, no, we probably are not. If we were, we wouldn't be having these fatalities.
Aside from what we've already talked about, so what are some other ways that companies can stay proactive in their management of chemical safety rather than simply be reactive, right? Because I think probably the worst thing you can do is simply wait for an incident to happen, and someone gets hurt, someone gets exposed, and then react to that, and have a flurry of activity. So, what can these organizations do to head that off? In addition to some of the things we've already mentioned.
Yeah, so I think first and foremost is to kill the attitude of we've always done it this way. If there was a way to just get rid of that attitude, I wish I could, because I'd make you and I would be rich. We'd be Elon Musk of safety, right? If we could figure out a way to destroy that attitude. But that attitude in a lot of ways is what gets us in trouble. So there has to be a top-down push, and I mean the most senior levels of management, that we're not going to accept we've always done it that way as the answer. We need to be innovative. We need to look for things. One of the things with chemical safety, and that I think is often overlooked, is if I'm purchasing from ABC Chemical, then I can call them well in advance and say, send me the SDS sheet and send me all the chemical information you have for the chemical that we're about to purchase. This is before it gets shipped to us. This is before it's received by us. This is before it's stored by us. And this is certainly before it's used by us. We can get all that information. We can have our safety team, our supervisory team take a look at it, and then start to train the employees, whether they're in the warehouse, whether they're in the operating units where this material is going to be used, or whether they're the employees that are going to be directly handling it. We can get them trained up before it ever arrives on site. There's no need for us to sit back and wait. And I think that's part of what you were talking about, was doing the upstream portion, not waiting until it's downstream and now in our lap before we decide to train on it. Let's look ahead. We can do that.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think it's a great point, and it's something that we run into quite a bit, in the technology business, where it intersects with safety, health and safety, where there's this idea that, hey, if something has been in place and has been continuously, being used, some sort of process or training or whatever, for decades, then that must be the right way to go, right? And
But
there's that. I think obviously that's not everywhere, but in some places I think it's pretty pervasive, that this idea that, hey, this is how we've always done it, and therefore that's the right way.
yeah,
Traditional
yeah,
knowledge.
yeah, which brings up a great point, and it's one that I think having a questioning attitude is very healthy.
Mhm. You've worked with a lot of clients, and you mentioned OSHA and some of the rules and penalties and the audits a few times. So, what are some of the most common problems that you see identified in audits, whether it's internal or an OSHA audit, and how can organizations get ahead of those sorts of problems that get
Yeah,
caught in
and
audits?
yeah, that's a great question. I think there are some things that are often repeated, and it's sad to see. We all look at the end of the year for OSHA's top 10 non-compliance issues, and there are
Mhm.
two that stand out. One of them is fall protection, or the lack of fall protection, and another one is always the hazard communication standard. And that one always boggles my mind. I don't quite understand that. How does that one end up on the top 10 list every
Mhm.
year? Well, it ends up there because we're not obviously not doing it. There's a lot of different elements to the hazard communication standard. It is not just collecting safety data sheets and putting them in a book. We have to train our employees on them. We have to know that they know what the 4 primary routes of exposure are. We have to know that they know what the different forms of material are, whether it's a gas, whether it's a fume, whether it's a vapor, whether it's a solid, whether it's a liquid. And then some of the technical, how to read a safety data sheet. Do our employees know how, and do they know what that means? The fact that you can read a safety data sheet, can you put it into practical terms for everyday use? Those are areas where I think we're still failing. If we weren't, we wouldn't end up with it on the top 10 OSHA list every year.
Yeah, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. In some of the applications that we provide to our clients, there's a lot of emphasis on not just kind of sharing information, but also making sure that it was properly absorbed, right? I
Yeah.
think that's just as important. And yeah, that you mentioned, you mentioned about not just telling them about these hazards and communicating the information, but also making sure that they got it, right, that they
Right.
remember it,
Exactly.
that they
Yeah.
that they got the right details out of the lesson.
Yeah.
And so yeah, for our, like, for example, our learning management system, there's a big emphasis on creating custom tests, whether it's through the computer or offline, and in-person assessment, if it's like using PPE or operating equipment, things like that, and other things like action items. And it's one thing to say, hey, go investigate this thing, and then file it away somewhere, right? But it's another thing for there to be follow up, and for people to actually
Yes.
review the findings and to take those lessons and actually apply them. So yeah, there's a wide gulf between those two approaches.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, there's the sharing of information, then there's the retention, and then there's the practical application. And
Yeah,
we have to have all of those. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Okay, so before we move on to Q&A here, would you mind just telling people how they can contact you if they want to kind of tap into your expertise, or
Oh,
have any
yeah,
follow-ups?
certainly. Yeah, thank you very much. So Peak Safety Solutions, Inc., and we're incorporated here in the state of Indiana. And my phone number is 765-505-8630. That's a mobile number. It's the only number I have. So I'm available anywhere in the world with that number. My email address is pretty simple, safetydanh@yahoo.com.
Okay,
And
perfect.
I've had that email address now for well over 20 years. So it's been working all that time. Yeah. And
Great.
then
All right.
finally,
Well,
I do have a website, and it
okay.
is peaksafetysolutions.net.
Okay. Perfect. Yeah. We'll
All right.
add that to the webinar so folks can
Okay.
access it easily. So great.
Great.
Well, we'll turn it over to Q&A now.
So one question we got was, I'm kind of paraphrasing a bit, but can you tell us a bit about the chemical weapons decommissioning work that you've done, and how does that, what similarities and differences are there between that process and the process of disposing of hazardous chemicals in general? So seems like a very novel and extreme situation. Let's see. It looks like we're having a bit of technical difficulty here.
Hello, Ren.
Yep. There you are.
Hey, Ren. Yeah, I'm sorry. Sorry, I had a little bit of technical difficulty. Thank you very much. So, in response to your question, this is an ongoing effort. This is the fourth Kim D mill site that I've been a part of, and I can tell you it's a very well controlled. The science that goes into it, the oversight that goes into it, before anybody gets anywhere near these chemical weapons, there is a host of review by different agencies, from Department of the Army, Department of Defense, DITRA, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, the Office for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and then of course the different contractors that work destroying these weapons. So there's a whole host of different safety engineers, industrial hygienists, environmentalists, and senior level management people from the different agencies, as well as the contract groups that work these programs, that take a very close look. The hazard assessment and risk analysis is very thoroughly done. And I can say, in my experience and from what I know, there has never been a single exposure to the most deadly nerve agents that we've been destroying in the history of the program, which started in the early 70s. So I think it's been a very successful program in that regard.
That's great. I mean, certainly any kind of exposure is just catastrophic in that kind of environment. So it's great to hear that there's been basically a spotless record on that account. And along the same lines, I'd be curious to hear, you relayed at the beginning of the webinar kind of a personal story about someone that you knew that had a safety incident that was very costly. And so I was just curious, in your many years of working with hazardous chemicals and even with chemical weapons, have you had any close calls or any exposures yourself?
Me personally, yeah, I have in the refinery and the chemical processing industry. There have been some close calls, but I was also an emergency responder, so I did more than just safety in those events. And there have been some close calls. I have not been overcome. I've not had any experiences that were left me with any chronic issues. There were some acute issues. I don't know if you're familiar with methyl mercaptan. Methyl mercaptan is a chemical that is added to natural gas to odorize it, to give it a smell. Otherwise, it wouldn't have one. And I was downwind of a barrel that was put onto a barrel crushing operation, and I was about 50 yards from that barrel and downwind, and there was probably a 1/4 inch of liquid still in the methyl mercaptan barrel when it was crushed, and that did knock me to the ground and caused me to nearly vomit. But again, that was no lasting effect. It was a very acute effect, and once I, went crosswind and got out of it quickly, got up and ran crosswind and was able to get into some fresh air, I recovered rather quickly. But I have never forgotten that particular incident.
Wow, that's incredible how much how much damage just a tiny amount of some of these chemicals can do, and in this case, it's just a odorizing agent. So it's interesting. So another question we got is regarding SDSs, so safety data sheets. So do you have any tips or kind of best practices when it comes to SDSs for both hazardous and non-hazardous chemicals? So what are some common mistakes that you see people make, and any kind of just general best practices for handling SDSs?
Yeah, I think so. So there are 16. Thankfully, we have now. I'm lost for a word here. What we've done is we've made all SDSs look the same. Back in the day, when I first got started in the safety business, you might pick up an SDS sheet that had 21 pages, and the information was kind of scattered all over it. And you really had to do some homework to figure out what you were looking for. Now there are 16 sections to every SDS. Number one is the name and the common names and the contact information. And area number 4 is always the first aid. And so I look at those two things first. And the reason is because I want to know not only what the UN 4-digit number is for that particular chemical, so you can identify it in shipping and on a label or a placard, but also what the synonyms are, what the other names it's called. And sometimes that's where we lose track of things, because we want to call it by the manufacturer's name rather than look at the synonyms, because there may be 4 or 5 or 6 or more synonyms that particular material is called by. And then also, almost immediately we should look at section 4, which is first aid in the event that there's an exposure. So what are the routes of exposure? What do we do to protect ourselves? What is the first aid information in the event that there is an exposure? And those areas should be probably some of our first concerns.
Okay, gotcha. All right, so we're coming up on time here, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time on this webinar. But one more question we got is, are there any professional resources or communities you've used that have been helpful in your career working with chemical safety? So any organizations, any resources, any groups that you found helpful?
Yeah, that's there are so many of them out there, but certainly the Chemical Manufacturers Association always has good references and good materials. The CDC, NIOSH puts out a couple of good reference books that we need to look at. The Emergency Response Guidebook from the DOT is always a good resource, although it's limited in its information. But one of the ones that I like to use is the pocket guide to chemical pocket guide from NIOSH, which I think is an excellent book. That's one that I refer to frequently. Used it even again this morning, and something I'm doing here at the plant. So there are references out there that I like to use. And most of them are pretty good. And then of course the SDS is always a good resource. But yeah, the CMA is a great one again, like I said. And there are other resources out there. Not obviously OSHA has their list of chemical hazards that need to be looked at, and they identify specific ones that are probably the most commonly used in industry, as well as some of the most acute. So and those that have known histories of chronic issues. So lead, cadmium, zinc, asbestos, those things. So they're all in there, and OSHA also has their list. So I would look at Part Z if you would. So.
Okay, perfect. All right, Dan, thank you so much for your time here. This has been really enlightening, and thank you for sharing your wealth of experience with us. So so that concludes the webinar, and thanks again to you and to all the attendees today.
Ren, thank you so much for having me.